But turning to the Gaskins article, it talks about the interview. The interview is just under 20 minutes, but includes Rosaria's key slogans that summarize her message and those of the SSA movement. Those of the SSA movement. What's the SSA movement? I mean that is not a meaningful category. What are you talking about there? Because you can't, for example, in this interview, Rosaria specifically says she rejects the terminology of gay Christian. And she explains why, from a linguistic perspective. You're modifying, you're changing the meaning of Christian based upon your self-identity. This is inappropriate. But what's the SSA movement? We're not told. There is much problematic content in this interview, more than space allows to relay, and discerning readers will want to view it in its entirety. I agree. Please do. Because I think if you are willing to listen without bias and prejudice, you're not going to be bothered by almost anything. Born this way. Because of the fall, we are all born some way. Rosaria teaches that the fall means we are each born with a particular sinful inclination, and homosexuality is such an inclination. Homosexuality is an ethical outworking of original sin. Quote, this is quoting Rosaria. Homosexuality is an ethical outworking of original sin. Do you know what that means? We're born that way. End quote. Now, here again, and if Diane Gaskins had not identified herself as being Reformed, I would have found this very confusing. Well, no. If she hadn't, I wouldn't have been as confused. But since she identifies herself as Reformed, I do find this confused. But I also have to recognize that, in my experience, there are people who are Calvinistic regarding general soteriological schemes, but not Reformed in their anthropology. They may profess the T, but they won't let the T go as deeply as the T goes. Total depravity. And this is especially true about original sin. I think a large portion of the Southern Baptist Convention doesn't believe in original sin at all. I'm pretty sure that the traditionalists don't, not in any meaningful fashion. Anyway, homosexuality is an ethical outworking of original sin. Is there something wrong with that? It's not the original sin, is it? Is homosexuality the original sin? No. So it is an ethical outworking of it, right? I mean, that's what Romans 1 says. I mean, because it's used as an example of what happens when idolatry goes to full flower and ends up influencing the entirety of mankind in the entirety of mankind's experience, even to the point of one's sexual desires, which you would think are hardwired for the continuation of the species. And yet even that can be perverted. But clearly that's not the original sin, right? So it is the ethical outworking of original sin. Do you know what that means? We're born that way. Born fallen. Every one of us is born fallen and born sexually broken in some fashion. And I think the reason that people struggle with this is because they want to think that all of the Me Too movement, what was it you were just reading me? 65% or something of sex slaves in the United States. In the United States, come out of foster care. Yeah, so you have the human trafficking, sex slaves, all over the world. I mean, the guy who did not kill himself. Yeah, Epstein. As far as we can tell, Epstein wasn't a homosexual. But are you going to tell me that his sin was somehow less because of that? And see, and this is where the category stuff comes in. This is where we have to think categorically. There is something fundamentally disordered in homosexual desire because it goes kataphusis, against nature. It's against the created order. And in the sense that adultery or fornication between a man and a woman does not go against the created order in the sense of the desires that define men and women. So in other words, you don't have the Romans 1, they left the natural function of the male and either direction. So it's different on that level because it involves the impact upon the natural created desires of man that allows the species to continue. But does the difference in character, that it is disordered, does that make it worse than the serial rapist or the serial committer of adultery that spreads venereal disease or whatever else? And the thinking is, yeah, as long as it's disordered, that somehow makes it morally worse. And on that basis, that's why there are certain people, I think Steven Anderson's one of them, that does not believe that homosexuals can be saved. And remember, he does something really goofy weird with 1 Corinthians 6 to try to get around what that is specifically referring to. But there's a confusion there of the fact that there is something about homosexuality that is specifically disordered and saying that makes it the worst of all sins. It's not original sin. And how you rank it is really going to depend, from God's perspective, on what you know and what your intentions are in the commission of it. So someone, and again, Jesus says to cities in Galilee in his day, it will be more tolerable for the people who surrounded Lot's house and wearied themselves trying to get in once blinded than for you. Have you thought about that? Have you thought about what that means? Again, we're going to Israel next year. Keep that in mind, folks. Less than a year now. And I can't help but think about visiting Bethsaida, these cities that were specifically mentioned, and thinking about why would Jesus say it will be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah, which were destroyed by God with fire and brimstone, than for Chorazin and Bethsaida? Why? I know that Lot was a righteous man, though, boy, I'll tell you, over the weekend, Lot came up in the discussion, and there were some people that just wouldn't get off of it. They would not. I mean, they wouldn't accept Peter's statements about Lot and his soul and being a righteous man, or none of that stuff. Lot was just a bad man. Anyway, we're not given any indication that Lot functioned as a prophet amongst these people. We don't see him out in the city square preaching. He eventually does. He does say to them, "Do not do this great evil." And it's when he identifies what they want to do as evil that they go crazy and try to break the door down and everything else. Could we argue that Lot should have been identifying their indolence and indulgence and selfishness and pride and arrogance as sin before this point in time? We're just not given enough information to know those things. But the point is, if you take Jesus's teaching at face value, seriously, He's saying the amount of light that you have is all important. And in comparison to the light that Chorazin and Bethsaida had, because he who made light was walking through their streets, because he had ministered in their synagogues, because he had preached the unvarnished word of God, and they didn't care. It's not that they attacked him. They just didn't care. They were so in love with their self-indulgent lifestyle. Not that those little villages would have been the homes of would have had the homes of a lot of rich people in them. But even the poorer people, apathetic. And the Son of God's walking amongst them. It's one of the reasons, by the way, why some of the expression of divine attributes had to be laid aside. Can you imagine if Jesus is walking along and he still has the Shekinah glory of God? I think he would have been reacted to a little bit differently. But he just looks like the carpenter's son. And yeah, his words, they're convicting, but maybe someday. It seems that Jesus was saying that is more reprehensible in the sight of God than what the guys in Sodom and Gomorrah were doing. And maybe that's why we don't like to think about it this way. Maybe that's why we like having homosexuality as the worst possible sin. Because it's too easy to sound like you're from Chorazin and Bethsaida. So when she says we're born that way, what she's saying is we are born in original sin. We are born broken. And does someone disagree with this? Then it says Rosaria Butterfield discounts the idea. Well, the subtitle is, we are all messy. All sins are equal except unbelief is worse. Rosaria Butterfield discounts the idea that any sin is more heinous than another. Quote, we should not think of our gay and lesbian neighbors as struggling with something that is different. It is part of the human condition, end quote. Now, why does that say, where does that say what the subtitle said? It doesn't say that. And it's not saying all sins are equal. It is saying that the root sins that give rise to the later sins are the sins that have to be dealt with. If you simply deal with the fruit that comes later on rather than the root, you accomplish nothing. I know that she used an illustration. It's a good illustration because I remember this, but no one in Arizona gets this. Well, no one in the desert. Remember dandelions? Okay. I'll bet you there are kids that have grown up in Phoenix that have never seen one. I mean, if everybody around you has their desert lawn, how would you know? Yeah, you grew up in Prescott, and so you had grass. And when dandelions would come up, how did the seed spread? Once the flower goes, you get these seed pods that open up, and then the wind blows the seeds everywhere, and I think that was designed. I'm not sure about you. I think someone designed that because it works very, very effectively. Palm tree seeds do the same thing. You ever notice palm tree seeds can get almost anywhere? Same thing. So what was the worst thing you could do when you had dandelions? Was to just lop the tops of the heads off. Because that would just spread the seeds. And then weeds, where do you got to get the weeds at? Got to get them in the root. If you just took your lawnmower, ran over, all you're doing is just creating the world's greatest seed distribution service ever. And they're going to come back. And they're going to come back with a vengeance because now it's getting blown all over the place. It's a very effective seed distribution system. And that's the illustration that she used. If you just lop off the top, if you lop off the fruit sin rather than the root sin, it's just going to keep manifesting itself because you're not dealing with what's giving rise to it. And so is the argument that idolatry and pride are the root that need to be gotten to rather than mere manifestations? Is the argument that she's saying that that means homosexuality isn't a sin or it isn't relevant. She repented of this stuff. How would that be the case? What she's saying is nothing impacted her until the reality of what she was seeing in Scripture came true in her life, and that is she is a prideful person who thinks she's in control of all of her relationships and her entire destiny. And it's God that's in charge. And if God's in charge, then God says you live this way, and therefore I have to line myself up with God's will. And the Reformed error in this is what exactly? We're not told. We're not told because what's being appealed to by Mrs. Gaskins is this idea of there is an assumed orthodoxy that we all just get it. And if she doesn't sound like us in the way she says these things, there must be a reason. It's that Henri Nouwen guy. And it's that other occult lady, and we're going to find the hidden messages and all the rest of that kind of stuff. But notice that even in the statement, she is saying that homosexuality is a manifestation of original sin. It's the fall. That's not what the gay Christian movement is saying when it describes homosexuality as a gift from God. How can you not see this? Well, the only way you can't see that is if you have a really, really, really major, thing going on. Now, so Mrs. Gaskin says, while it is true that any sin is sufficient to merit an eternity in hell, she wasn't talking about that. That's not what Rosaria was talking about. She's talking about the relationship of sins, and that sins rarely exist unto themselves, separated from everything else. This is an important insight. It's a good insight. So why are we now going someplace else? Is it because she doesn't understand, or that she doesn't have a response to what Rosaria is actually saying? I don't know. I can't tell.